The Portland-class cruisers make for a fascinating pair of ships. USS Indianapolis is by far and away the more famous of the two, due in large part to her sinking, and it being referenced in Jaws. However, this has led to Portland being largely overshadowed by her sister, in spite of her own extensive wartime service, from Coral Sea to Midway and even Surigao Strait, and most notably at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, where Portland would suffer severe torpedo damage, yet continue on fighting anyway as best as she could. In the end, the ship would earn 16 battle stars, one of the single most decorated ships in the United States Navy. So, in any other circumstance, Portland would be a very famous ship. However, because of her sister's sinking, she's more often overlooked. Let's try and make up for that today. I'll cover Indianapolis too at some point, but for this video, it's her sister's turn to shine. Let's get into that now. Portland's story began as a modification of the Northampton-class cruisers, the most notable change coming in thicker armor protection. There were some other more minor changes I'll go over when looking at her design. For the moment, though, Portland was ordered to that modified design. 5 ships were originally ordered, but in the end 3 of them, New Orleans, Astoria, and Minneapolis, would be reordered to a new design. That ship, the New Orleans class, would become the blueprint for future American heavy cruisers, while Portland and Indianapolis remained a weird midway point. I'll note that you'll sometimes see it cited as 8 ships ordered to the original design, though Friedman only cites the 5. Now you might be wondering why the Navy kept them to that design in this regard. The answer is fairly simple. Portland and Indianapolis were built by private shipyards, Bethlehem's Fore River Shipyard and the New York Shipbuilding Corporation respectively. The other 3, meanwhile, were built by naval shipyards. Those could eat the delay to change the design without as much worry about cost. The private yards, on the other hand, would have wanted quite a bit of money for such a drastic delay. Thus, Portland and Indianapolis would become an intermediate design instead of changing like their erstwhile sisters. You can see a legacy of this change in the ship numbers. New Orleans was CA-32, with Astoria being CA-34. Portland was CA-33, while Indianapolis was CA-35. These ships were ordered as a set, then changed after the fact. Regardless, that rounds off the background. Let's touch on the design real quick before moving to service history. As noted, this was more of an evolution of Northampton rather than a fresh design. Portland had a length of 610 feet, 186 meters, and a beam of 66 feet, or 20 meters. By comparison, Northampton was 600 feet, 180 meters long, with an identical 66-foot beam. You can really see this similarity in hull form when looking at side profiles. The ships are very similar down to catapult placement and the shape along with the position of the funnels. The biggest change in appearance came from the bridge structure. Gone was the massive tripod, replaced by a much smaller affair. The bridge wings are different as well, with the overall bridge tower being smaller. Still, when looked at like this, you can see the intermediate nature of Portland's design. Even the tonnage was broadly similar. Portland displaced 9,800 tons at her standard loading. Northampton was 9,050 by comparison, with that increase largely coming from the extra armor protection. Northampton's main belt reached a maximum thickness of 3.75 inches, 95 millimeters. Portland increased this to an even 5 inches, 127 millimeters at the thickest. Not a massive jump, but still a noted improvement. Firepower, on the other hand, was largely identical. Portland carried the same 3 triple turrets with the same 9 8-inch, 203 millimeter guns, a super firing pair on the bow, and a single turret on the stern. The secondary battery was also the same as her predecessor at 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns. Meanwhile, dedicated anti-aircraft defense began as a smattering of machine guns, though this was dramatically increased in service. By the end of the Pacific War, Portland carried 24 40mm Bofors guns and 17 20mm cannon. This might seem relatively light by American standards, but that's simply a legacy of the aging design and a lack of free deck space. In any event, that just leaves the speed. This was pretty standard for an American cruiser, just under 33 knots on 107,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With this rounding off the design, bringing us back to service history, of which Portland has quite a lot, as noted at the start, with her story beginning on February 17, 1930. The ship was laid down at the aforementioned Bethlehem Shipbuilding Yard in Quincy, Massachusetts, with Portland launched on May 21, 1932, and commissioned on February 23, 1933. About as close to 3 years to the day as you get for her overall construction process. Not particularly fast or slow by the standards of a peacetime fleet. On the other hand, Portland's service would quickly become exciting. On April 4, 1933, she would receive word of the loss of USS Akron, one of the 2 famous flying aircraft carriers of the Interwar Navy. Portland was one of the first ships to receive word of this crash. Within 36 minutes, the cruiser was underway, and she would be the first naval vessel to arrive at the crash site, where Portland coordinated the search and rescue operation. Alas, 73 men aboard the airship would be lost, including an Admiral, William Moffett, the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Only 4 survivors were plucked from the water by a German merchant, with 1 dying aboard the ship. For Portland, the remainder of 1933 through late 1935 was spent on decidedly less eventful service. The cruiser would spend her time on various training exercises, as was usually the case, including the various fleet problems, the massive interwar fleet exercises. This would have seen the ship train in both the Caribbean and the Pacific at varying points. Because of this, it wasn't until October 1935 that something more noteworthy happened again. Specifically on October 2nd, when she left San Diego alongside the older USS Houston. That cruiser was, as she often did, carrying President Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR would remain aboard Houston until October 23rd, with Portland providing the obligatory escort duty. Once the president departed, Portland returned to her usual work, including crossing the equator for the first time on May 20th, 1936. I'm almost more impressed it took 3 years, if I'm being honest. Regardless, Portland spent the remainder of the 1930s training and visiting various ports. In this, she was part of Cruiser Division 5 of the Scouting Force. In any event, Portland would largely remain in the Pacific. She wasn't assigned to the Atlantic Neutrality Patrol when World War II kicked off. Indeed, Portland was still in the Pacific into 1941, when Japan would drag the United States into the war. In her case, she was fortunate enough to not be at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Portland was instead en route to Midway as part of an aircraft ferry run. In this, she was escorting USS Lexington. As such, Portland was undamaged and available for escort duty, a role she would remain on through the remainder of December 1941 and the early months of 1942. In fact, she would spend her time sailing between Fiji, the West Coast, and Hawaii until May 1st, 1942. Portland wouldn't see actual combat duty until the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942. Admittedly, this isn't very surprising. American warships in the first months of 1942 saw two different stories in the Pacific: the surface actions of the Asiatic Fleet in the Java Sea, or the various raids by the aircraft carriers across the Pacific. As Portland wasn't in the Asiatic Fleet, her direct combat options were rather limited. Even at Coral Sea, she would only be able to provide anti-aircraft defense for Yorktown. Unfortunately, at this point of the war, Portland didn't have much to offer there, mostly her 5-inch guns. Still, the cruiser did her job and did it as well as she could. Yorktown would ultimately survive, while Lexington would be crippled and eventually scuttled, with Portland assigned to escort Lexington before then being tasked with picking up survivors, with the cruiser in particular taking on 722 men. For her part, Portland went without damage or losses, aside from 4 men transferred to the lost tanker Neosho prior to the battle. Meanwhile, her next combat operation would come at Midway, once more escorting Yorktown, though this time the carrier would suffer far worse damage. Destroyers would pick up survivors after the ship was abandoned before transferring those men to Portland. Loaded down with 2,046 survivors, the cruiser sailed to Pearl Harbor, though Portland actually met up with the tender USS Fulton before arrival. The Yorktown sailors were transferred off at this point. After dropping those men off, Portland took up escort duty with Saratoga, a short-lived affair, with Portland returning to other escort work through summer 1942, ultimately ending up assigned to escort USS Enterprise in early August, with this task force sailing to the South Pacific for the invasion of Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. Portland would remain with Enterprise and thus miss the early surface actions such as Salvo Island. One can argue she was lucky in that regard. As a result, Portland's next taste of combat would follow the same pattern: the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where she was once more tasked with protecting a carrier from air attack. Enterprise would suffer damage during this, but she would survive, while Portland again avoided damage of her own. Interestingly, Sweet Pea at War cites a secret raid by Portland after escorting Enterprise to Pearl Harbor. Portland and USS San Juan would raid the Gilbert Islands, with Portland in particular attacking Tarawa. On October 15, 1942, she would bombard the island and engage a couple Japanese ships. Portland claimed to damage a freighter and destroyer during this attack. In any event, after this, she returned to escorting Enterprise, just in time for Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942. This time, Portland would suffer damage of her own when one of her Chicago piano mounts exploded. Still, to this point, Portland had evaded any damage of note. Unfortunately, her luck ran out in catastrophic fashion in her next battle, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942. Portland would take a torpedo hit to the stern, which jammed the cruiser in a circular turn. Despite this, Portland would fight back hard. Her gunners engaged multiple targets, including the destroyer Udachi. This would be sunk after the battle came to an end, though by this point the destroyer was abandoned. Portland is also sometimes cited as hitting Hiei. In spite of this success, Portland was still in desperate need of repair work. The cruiser was sent off for this, with most of it taking place from December 1942 to early 1943 in Sydney, Australia, before final work was done in March 1943 at the Mare Island shipyard, with Portland returning to the war in late May 1943 for a trip to the Aleutian Islands. This would see her bombard Kiska on July 26, 1943, with the ship spending June through August in Alaskan waters before shifting back to Pearl Harbor on September 23rd. Her next combat action following this was a return to the Gilberts, where Portland would spend November 1943 through February 1944 escorting carriers on their airstrikes, along with a second bombardment of Tarawa on November 20th, and a similar bombardment of Eniwetok on February 8, 1944. All pretty standard for this part of the war, and a pattern that continued through most of 1944, with Portland either escorting carriers or conducting shore bombardments through to May 1944. On May 5th, however, naval inspectors went aboard to investigate reports of rudder trouble. As it turned out, Portland was in desperate need of an overhaul. A high-speed turn could cause water to leak through loose rivets, among other issues. So Portland would miss the Marianas campaign. She was in refit in California from late May 1944 through to August 7th, at which point she sailed for her next combat duty, covering the invasion of Peleliu on September 15, 1944, which would be largely uneventful. The same cannot be said, however, for the next stint off of the Philippines. Portland would be part of 7th Fleet for this operation, covering the landing forces from October 17th through the 24th. And as part of 7th Fleet, she would join the old standards in Surigao Strait on the night of October 24th, 1944. Portland's guns contributed to the destruction of the Japanese Southern Force, most notably the cruiser Mogami. After this, Portland would spend the rest of 1944 and early 1945, January through March, on further Philippine operation, including bombarding Corregidor on February 15, 1945. Portland only moved on in late March, where she would spend March 26th through April 20th supporting the Okinawa invasion. During this, the cruiser was repeatedly subjected to kamikaze attack. Up to 24 such raids, though her luck held out, and Portland continued to avoid damage from aircraft. Ultimately, the ship would end the war in Buckner Bay, conducting bombardments from August 6, 1945, to the end of the war on August 15th. After this, Portland would accept the surrender of the Carolines and then round off her service on Operation Magic Carpet transport runs, before being decommissioned on July 12, 1946. Despite her extensive service, there were no apparent efforts to save the ship as a museum. Portland would ultimately be sold for scrap in 1959 and scrapped completely by 1962, with the exception of her tripod mast, which is preserved at Fort Allen Park in Portland. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.